There's a road being built right now that almost nobody outside of Kabul and Beijing has seen. It runs through one of the most remote, most fought-over pieces of land on the entire planet, a narrow finger of mountains just a few dozen miles wide, squeezed between Tajikistan and Pakistan, ending at a heavily guarded fence on the border of China. For over a century, this exact strip of land was a buffer zone, a place two empires agreed to leave empty, specifically so their armies would never have to look at each other across it. Now it has a highway running through it, built by the Taliban, funded, in part, by ambitions in Beijing, and almost entirely hidden from public view. No press releases, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, barely any footage at all. So what exactly did they build up there? Who's it really for? And why does a regime that bans internet access and censors its own journalists suddenly want the world to notice a road? Let's find out. To understand why a gravel road through a mountain pass matters to two of the world's biggest powers, you have to understand what this land actually is and what it has always been. Afghanistan sits landlocked in South Central Asia, a country of roughly 43 million people, bordered by Pakistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and, through one narrow, improbable strip of territory, China itself. That strip is called the Wakhan Corridor. It's about 350 kilometers long and, in places, barely 16 kilometers wide. Some of the most remote, least visited terrain on Earth sits inside it. High-altitude valleys where nomadic herding communities have lived for generations, cut off from the rest of the country by geography alone. Here are the facts worth anchoring before anything else, because this is a story that gets misrepresented easily if you don't start with them. In August 2021, the Taliban, a hardline Islamist political and militant movement that first seized power in Afghanistan in the 1990s, retook control of the country as U.S. and NATO forces completed a withdrawal after nearly 20 years of war. Since then, independent human rights organizations, the United Nations, and journalists on the ground have documented a sharp escalation in restrictions imposed by the Taliban as the governing authority, including barring girls from secondary and university education, restricting women's movement and employment, and tightly controlling press access within the country. This video treats those documented actions of the Taliban government as exactly that: actions and policies of a specific governing regime, not a reflection on Islam as a faith or on the Afghan people, who are themselves ethnically and culturally diverse, and who, according to the same reporting, have shown consistent, documented resistance to many of these restrictions, particularly around girls' education. That distinction matters because the story of this road is, underneath everything else, a story about a government trying to survive economically while much of the world keeps its distance. Afghanistan has been called, for good reason, the graveyard of empires. Alexander the Great marched through it. Genghis Khan's armies swept across it. The Mughals, the Persians, the Arabs, wave after wave of conquest. And yet no empire ever managed to hold this territory for long. In the 19th century, it became the stage for something historians call the Great Game, a decades-long rivalry between the British and Russian empires, each maneuvering to keep the other out of this exact stretch of Central Asia. The Wakhan Corridor itself exists as a matter of historical record because of that rivalry. It was carved out deliberately in the late 1800s as a buffer, a narrow strip of neutral ground specifically designed so that British India and the Russian Empire would never share a direct border. A buffer zone, by definition, is a place built to keep powers apart. What's being built there now does the opposite. It's built to connect them. The 20th century didn't loosen the world's grip on Afghanistan. If anything, it tightened it. In 1979, the Soviet Union sent troops into the country to prop up a communist government fighting an insurgency of Islamist guerrilla fighters known as the Mujahideen. Moscow expected a short intervention. It got 9 years of grinding war and a Cold War proxy fight in the process. The Soviets backing Kabul, the United States quietly arming the Mujahideen through intermediaries. The Soviets withdrew in 1988, having lost the war in every meaningful sense. Afghanistan collapsed into civil war shortly after, and in 1996, the Taliban seized Kabul for the first time, declaring an Islamic emirate. What followed is well documented and doesn't need embellishment. The Taliban, during that first period in power, sheltered al-Qaeda, the militant organization responsible for planning the September 11th attacks on the United States. In response, a U.S.-led coalition invaded in October 2001, removed the Taliban from power within months, and stayed for nearly 2 decades attempting to stabilize a new Afghan government and train its security forces. Despite that 2-decade presence, the political situation never fully settled. In the summer of 2021, the United States and its NATO allies withdrew entirely. The withdrawal was chaotic, and within days, the Taliban walked back into Kabul largely unopposed, retaking the country they'd lost 20 years earlier. Which brings us to now. A Taliban government running a nation that most of the world's major economies still refuse to formally recognize, sitting on top of mineral wealth worth, by some estimates, close to $1 trillion in untapped copper, lithium, and rare earth deposits it has almost no way to extract or sell competitively. Isolated, cash poor, diplomatically radioactive to most of the West. And about 400 miles away, in Beijing, a very different kind of power was watching all of this with a specific kind of interest, one that had nothing to do with ideology, and everything to do with what a map like this can offer a country trying to move goods around the world without depending on anyone else's permission to do it. Here's the part of this story that most people miss, because it doesn't look like the geopolitics we're used to watching play out on the news. There are no troop movements, no summits, no treaties signed on camera. Just a country quietly building relationships, one investment at a time, in places most of the world had already written off. By the early 2020s, China had become Afghanistan's largest single source of foreign investment, and by late 2023, its third largest supplier of imports, remarkable numbers for a country that most Western governments treat as a diplomatic pariah. Beijing has gone as far as posting an ambassador in Kabul, one of the only major powers willing to maintain that level of formal engagement with the Taliban government. And the reason isn't sentiment, it's minerals and its geography. China's economy runs on rare earth elements and industrial metals, the copper that goes into every electric motor and power grid, the lithium that goes into every battery, the materials that underpin the entire next generation of manufacturing Beijing has built its long-term strategy around. Afghanistan happens to sit on staggering, largely untouched reserves of exactly those resources. For a Taliban government locked out of most formal international finance, unable to access frozen central bank reserves, and treated as untouchable by the IMF and World Bank, China represents something rare. A great power still willing to write checks. But the money is only half the story. The other half is the map itself. For over a decade, China has been building what it calls the Belt and Road Initiative, a sprawling global infrastructure project spanning ports, railways, and highways across Asia, Africa, and Europe, all designed around a single strategic goal: giving Chinese goods more ways to reach the rest of the world that don't run through waterways controlled, patrolled, or potentially blockaded by rival powers. One piece of that project is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a network of roads and rail already linking Western China to Pakistani ports on the Arabian Sea. For years, there's been quiet discussion in policy circles about extending that corridor further, through Afghanistan, and specifically through the Wakhan Corridor itself, the same narrow strip of mountains that used to exist purely to keep empires apart. This is where the highway comes in. According to Taliban officials, in January 2024, they completed a roughly 120-kilometer road running through the Wakhan Corridor toward the Chinese border at altitudes exceeding 5,000 meters, among the highest road construction anywhere on the planet. Officials have described it as a symbol of the country's economic future, a first physical link that could one day connect Afghanistan directly into China's trade network without needing to pass through Pakistan, Iran, or any third country at all. For a government this isolated, that's not just infrastructure, it's leverage. A landlocked country with almost no functioning economic relationships is, for the first time in decades, holding a card that a rising superpower might actually want to play. And yet, and this is the detail that should make you pause before accepting the triumphant version of this story, independent journalists who have gained rare access to the region describe something considerably less impressive than a modern trade corridor. What's there isn't paved highway. It's gravel. Rough, unfinished, difficult terrain that would require heavy investment in supporting infrastructure, bridges, staging areas, cold weather logistics, before it could carry anything resembling serious freight traffic. Reporting from the ground has also noted a near-total absence of visible cross-border trade activity at the frontier itself, and unusual difficulty securing permission to film anywhere near the actual road or the border crossing. That gap between how the Taliban has publicly described this project and what outside observers have actually been able to document is worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about how power gets performed, not just exercised. A government desperate to prove its own relevance to the outside world has strong incentive to describe a gravel path as a highway to the future. That doesn't make the road meaningless. It means the road's significance right now is more symbolic than economic. A down payment on a relationship, not yet the relationship itself. China, for its part, appears to be moving with real caution. Beijing has voiced specific security concerns about the border region, including the presence of militant groups operating in parts of northern Afghanistan that China worries could exploit any new, more porous crossing to move people or operations closer to its own territory. That's not a minor footnote. It's arguably the single biggest reason a fully open, heavily trafficked border crossing here remains, for now, a future possibility rather than a present reality. So what actually exists at the China-Afghanistan border today is something narrower and more interesting than either government's version of the story. Not a thriving new trade route, and not nothing either. A physical link that didn't exist 5 years ago. A relationship being tested cautiously by two governments that need very different things from each other. One desperate for legitimacy and cash, the other patient enough to extend influence one investment at a time without ever needing to fire a shot to do it. There's a version of this story that stays entirely in the language of trade corridors and mineral deposits. And if you stopped there, you'd understand the strategy, but miss the point. Because roads don't just move goods, they move lives. And nowhere is that more visible than in the high valleys the new highway actually cuts through. For centuries, a small nomadic community called the Kyrgyz, a Turkic ethnic group, most of whom live across the border in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and China itself, has herded yaks, goats, and camels through the Wakhan's high-altitude pastures, moving with the seasons the way their ancestors did. Today, only an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 of them remain on the Afghan side of that border, a population that has shrunk generation after generation as instability pushed many to flee. Some as recently as 2021, when a wave of Kyrgyz families crossed into Tajikistan, seeking refuge from the Taliban's return to power, only to return within weeks when humanitarian assistance never materialized, and there was, quite simply, nowhere else for them to go. Before this road existed, buying a bag of flour for bread could mean a multi-week journey on foot, leading pack animals across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the continent. Now, traders drive in with cars, apples, rice, pasta, basic goods that used to take weeks now arrive in days. For a community this remote, that's not a footnote in a geopolitical strategy. That's the difference between a hard life and an impossible one. And here's where the human picture gets more complicated, not less. In small mobile classrooms set up along the corridor, teachers now travel in for months at a time to educate Kyrgyz children, a direct benefit of the same road built for entirely different strategic reasons. But even here, deep in one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, the Taliban's restrictions on women and girls still reach. Girls are permitted to attend these informal lessons only until around the age of 12. Women in these communities continue their traditional work, herding, milking, food preparation. But under a government that has, since 2021, issued more than 70 decrees restricting their rights, according to documentation from international human rights monitors, including bans on secondary and university education, most employment, and unaccompanied movement in public spaces. This is the contradiction sitting at the center of the entire story, and it's worth naming directly rather than letting it pass by quietly. A road built by a regime that has made Afghan women's lives measurably harder is, at the same time, making some of the most isolated Afghan communities' lives measurably easier. Both of those things are independently true. Neither cancels the other out. That tension isn't a flaw in the story. It is the story, if you're being honest about it. Zoom back out to the geopolitical map, and this single gravel road becomes a small piece of something enormous. China's Belt and Road Initiative now touches, by various counts, well over 100 countries, ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan, railways across East Africa, highways through Central Asia, all built around the same underlying logic. Give Chinese trade more paths to the rest of the world, and make more countries economically dependent on Chinese capital and Chinese infrastructure in the process. Some nations that took this money have found real, tangible development. Others have found themselves owing debts they can't repay, handing over decades-long control of ports and infrastructure as collateral, a pattern serious enough that it has its own name in policy circles: debt trap diplomacy. Though the extent to which that's a deliberate Chinese strategy versus a predictable outcome of ambitious lending remains genuinely disputed among economists who study it. And this expansion isn't happening in a vacuum. The United States, currently locked in an extended trade dispute with Beijing, has been working actively to counter Chinese influence over global shipping, pushing to limit Chinese control of ports, contesting Chinese-linked maritime infrastructure from Panama to the Pacific, treating choke points and trade routes as a central front in a broader competition for economic leverage. Every new overland route China secures, including one as remote and unfinished as a gravel road through Afghanistan's highest mountains, is one more path that doesn't depend on the sea lanes and ports where American influence still runs deepest. That's what makes this specific, obscure stretch of road worth paying attention to. Not because it's already reshaping global trade. By every honest account, it isn't. Not yet. But because it's a small, early, visible piece of a much larger pattern. Two superpowers, competing not through armies, but through roads, ports, and investment in some of the poorest and most isolated corners of the world. Places most people will never see, holding leverage that will shape decisions made in Washington and Beijing for decades. So here's the question worth sitting with. Once you strip away the maps and the mineral estimates, Why would the Taliban, a government that restricts its own press, censors journalists, and initially tried to block outside reporters from even reaching this road, want the world to know about it at all? The answer says something important about what isolation actually does to a government, any government, not just this one. Since 2021, the Taliban has governed a country that most of the international community treats as illegitimate. Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations remains contested. Billions of dollars in the country's own central bank reserves remain frozen in foreign accounts, inaccessible to the government that would otherwise control them. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank have kept the country locked out of the kind of development financing that flows almost automatically to most other nations on Earth. Major aid organizations and foreign governments withdrew en masse. According to reporting from the New York Times and other outlets, more than half of Afghanistan's population now depends on humanitarian assistance simply to get by. And in 2025 alone, more than 2 million Afghans were forced to return from Pakistan and Iran as both countries tightened policies toward Afghan migrants and refugees, adding new strain to an economy with almost no capacity to absorb them. Put yourself, for a moment, in the position of a government facing that situation, not to excuse its record, which is extensively documented and genuinely severe, but to understand its incentives. When you're locked out of nearly every conventional avenue of legitimacy and finance, a highway becomes more than a highway. It becomes proof of function. Evidence, however modest, that you can still build something, attract someone, matter to somebody beyond your own borders. That's precisely why Taliban officials have publicly described this project in language far grander than the gravel road independent observers have actually documented, not necessarily as pure fabrication, but as the natural instinct of an isolated government reaching for whatever story makes it look less isolated. China's caution cuts against that story in an important way, and it's worth understanding why. Beijing has built its reputation on infrastructure diplomacy, showing up where other major powers won't, offering capital without the human rights conditions that Western lenders typically attach. But China is not indifferent to risk, and the risk here is specific and serious. Parts of northern Afghanistan, including areas near this very border region, have historically provided shelter to militant groups, some with stated ambitions against China's own restive western regions. A more open, more heavily trafficked border crossing doesn't just move trade goods faster. It potentially moves people, weapons, and influence faster too, in both directions. That's almost certainly why the Chinese side of this crossing remains, by every account, tightly sealed. Layered fencing, surveillance, a heavily monitored guard post, even as the diplomatic and economic relationship with Kabul continues to warm elsewhere. This is the paradox sitting at the heart of the entire relationship, and it explains almost everything else about how this story has unfolded. China wants access to Afghanistan's resources and the strategic value of a new overland route, but not the security risk of a wide-open border in one of the most historically volatile regions on the continent. The Taliban wants the legitimacy, investment, and trade access that a real partnership with Beijing could provide, but has so far been unable to deliver the security guarantees or infrastructure quality that would make China comfortable fully committing. Both governments need something the other isn't yet ready to give. That unresolved tension is exactly why what exists today looks the way it does. A finished road that isn't really finished, a border crossing that's open on paper but closed in practice, an economic relationship built more on potential than on present-day trade volume. Neither side has walked away. Neither side has fully committed either. And that middle space, cautious, transactional, unresolved, may turn out to be a more accurate picture of how 21st century power actually works than the dramatic version either government would prefer to tell. Because this isn't really a story about a road failing to live up to its promises. It's a story about what isolation does to a government's incentives and what caution does to a rising power's ambitions, and about how those two very different pressures met quietly in one of the most remote mountain passes on Earth and produced something that is neither the triumph Kabul describes nor the empty gesture skeptics might assume. Just a slow, careful, mutual test. The kind great powers and desperate governments have been running on each other for centuries, long before anyone thought to pave a road through it. Zoom out far enough, and this single gravel road stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like a symptom of something much bigger. A pattern repeating itself across dozens of countries most Western audiences never think to connect. Go back exactly a century, and the language would have been completely different, but the underlying instinct wouldn't have changed at all. In the age of empire, powerful nations extended their reach through colonies, garrisons, and formal spheres of influence, flags planted, territory claimed, administrators installed. That model eventually collapsed, expensive and politically untenable, and for a while, the story of global power looked more like the Cold War. Two superpowers competing through proxy wars, arms shipments, and ideological alliances, exactly the pattern that turned Afghanistan into a battlefield in the 1980s. What's happening now is quieter than either of those eras, and in some ways, harder to see coming. No flags, no proxy armies, at least not directly. Just capital, patiently, moving into the gaps left by countries the rest of the world has given up on. A port concession here, a mining rights agreement there, a highway through a mountain pass nobody else wanted to fund. Afghanistan, isolated and cash-starved, is simply one of the clearer examples of a strategy China has been running for over a decade across parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. Identify the countries locked out of Western capital, offer investment without political conditions attached, and let influence follow the money at whatever pace the relationship can bear. It's worth being precise about what this is and isn't, because the sensational version of this story, China is quietly conquering the developing world one road at a time, oversimplifies something more complicated and, frankly, more interesting. Some countries that have taken large-scale Chinese infrastructure investment have genuinely benefited. New ports, new rail lines, new roads that host governments couldn't have financed on their own, built years or decades faster than Western development aid typically moves. Others have ended up in exactly the position critics warn about, unable to service the debt, forced to renegotiate on unfavorable terms, sometimes handing over decades of control on strategic assets as a result. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port is the case most often cited, a facility built with Chinese loans that the Sri Lankan government, unable to keep up with repayment, eventually leased to a Chinese state-owned company for 99 years. Whether that outcome reflects a deliberate strategy or simply the predictable mathematics of large loans to fragile economies remains a genuinely contested question among the economists and policy researchers who study it closely. This video isn't going to pretend that debate is settled, because it isn't. What is settled, and what this story makes concrete in a way that abstract discussions of great power competition rarely manage, is this. The tools of influence in the 21st century increasingly look like roads, ports, mining rights, and telecommunications infrastructure. Unglamorous, easy to overlook, built slowly enough that no single moment ever looks like a crisis. Nobody wakes up one morning to a headline that says, "A country has lost its sovereignty over a mountain pass." It happens the way this highway happened. One modest announcement, one quiet investment, one gravel road at a time. Until years later, someone finally asks who actually holds the leverage here. And the answer turns out to be more complicated and more consequential than anyone assumed when construction began. That's the real thread connecting a buffer zone the British and Russians carved out to keep each other apart. A Cold War battlefield the Soviets and Americans fought over by proxy, and a modern highway two very different governments are testing on each other right now for entirely modern reasons. The tools change. The instinct doesn't. Whoever controls the ground other people need to cross eventually holds something money alone can't buy. And geography isn't the only kind of leverage a country can sit on top of without fully realizing its value. Sometimes it's something you can hold in your hand. Which is exactly where this story is headed next, to a substance that has functioned as the ultimate form of portable power for thousands of years, one that today sits quietly in vaults, mines, and central bank reserves across the entire planet, still shaping the decisions of nations in 2026, the exact same way it shaped them in ancient Rome. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. Stories like this one are exactly why I built this channel. Not the 5-minute headline version of the world, but the slower one, where you actually understand why things happen the way they do. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because there's a question worth pausing on before we leave Afghanistan behind entirely, and it's one I imagine some of you are already asking. If this road barely functions, if the border stays sealed, if the trade volume is essentially nothing right now, does any of this actually matter? It's a fair question, and the honest answer is yes, precisely because of how these things usually start. Every major trade route in human history looked unimpressive in its earliest years. The original Silk Road wasn't one continuous highway. It was a patchwork of unreliable caravan trails that took centuries to become the network history remembers. What matters isn't whether this specific road is thriving today. It's whether the relationship behind it keeps deepening. Whether Beijing decides, 5 or 10 years from now, that the security risk is worth the reward, and whether the Taliban manages to hold on to enough stability to still be the government standing there when that decision gets made. That's the pattern worth carrying forward, because it's about to show up again, in a completely different form. Because leverage doesn't only come from controlling a strip of land other people need to cross. Sometimes it comes from controlling a substance so universally trusted that it becomes power you can literally hold in your hand, small enough to carry across a border, dense enough to anchor an entire nation's reserves, and old enough that it was already functioning as the ultimate safe haven for wealth thousands of years before anyone thought to build a road, a canal, or a highway at all. 150 years ago, two empires looked at this exact stretch of mountains and decided the safest thing to do was leave it empty. A deliberate gap built so neither one would ever have to face the other across it. Soldiers, spies, and cartographers spent decades making sure that gap stayed exactly what it was supposed to be: nothing. Today, there's a road running through it, unfinished, unpaved in places, barely trafficked. And still, somehow, two of the most powerful governments on Earth are watching it closely. One, because it might finally offer a way out of isolation. The other because it might offer one more path around a world it no longer wants to depend on for anything. That's the part worth sitting with, not the road itself, what the road represents. That influence, in this century, rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with flags or armies or treaties signed for the cameras. It arrives quietly, one investment at a time, in the places most of the world stopped paying attention to a long time ago. And by the time anyone asks who actually holds the leverage there, the answer has usually already been decided. The people living in those high valleys didn't ask to be at the center of any of this. They just wanted a road that would let them buy flour without a 2-week walk. And they got it. Built for reasons that had almost nothing to do with them, by two governments that, for now, are still deciding exactly how far they're willing to go with each other. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought and tell me what you want to understand next. Because somewhere out there, right now, another quiet road is being built, and most of the world still doesn't know it exists.